Hi, I'm Dr. Evan Matthews. I'm here today to talk to you about exercise metabolism, and specifically this section is going to be talking about how we measure exercise metabolism. If you go back to part 1, we'll talk about how exercise affects metabolism and which metabolic pathways are being used as the primary energy source at what time and things like that. We also talked a little bit about muscle soreness, lactic acid, those sorts of things in part 1 of this video. So if you didn't already see part 1, please go back and watch that first and then come back to this video. So how do we measure exercise metabolism? All right, so one method of doing that is something called direct calorimetry. All right, so direct calorimetry is very similar to what we would do with trying to measure the calories inside of some sort of food product, where we put it into a bomb calorimeter, we'd catch it on fire and see how much heat comes off it. Instead of catching on a fire, we can't do that to a person, obviously. We're going to put the person inside a specially designed room, and this room has water pipes going through the walls. All right, so we put cold water in, we have the person exercising inside, and as the water runs through these walls, it's going to pick up the heat from the room inside, and that heat's going to go up because you're inside of it exercising, producing a lot of heat. Right? And so if you measure the heat coming out on the exit side of the pipes, the water is going to be hotter. And so we can look at the difference between the heat of the water going in and the heat of the water coming out, and then we can make assumptions about metabolism. So those assumptions that are essentially that 40% of our energy goes to actually producing ACP, the smallest unit of energy the body uses, and the other 60% is going to be used to essentially make heat. So it's a byproduct. So we're going to make 60% of our energy is going to go right to our byproduct of heat production. All right, so we can measure that heat production in this direct calorimetry room, and then we can make some assumptions already mentioned with that ratio of ATP to heat production to figure out your total energy production. The pros to doing direct calorimetry is that it's very accurate over long recording periods. So let's say instead of exercise, we wanted to see your just sort of activities of daily living, how much energy you produce. So we put you in this room that's essentially going to be set up like an apartment, and we just let you go through your activities of daily living, and we measure the heat that comes off your body through, again, these pipes filled with fluid in the walls. All right, so it's really good at that. It's also really good at doing resting measurements that are long resting measurements, like the ones I just described. You can probably see a lot of cons to all this, though. The main cons are going to be it's very expensive. All right, you have to design an entire room specifically designed for this measurement, and so it's going to be very pricey. It also takes a long time to get an accurate measurement. So if you're recording for a long time and you care about recording for a long time, and you want to see what happens over the course of a few days or something like that, or even a whole day, then this is going to be potentially a really great measure of that. Expensive measure, but it's still a great measure. However, when we're talking about things like exercise, usually we want to know what happens from going from rest to exercise, or increasing exercise intensity, or something that's going to happen over a very short period of time, 10, 20, 30 minutes, maybe up to an hour or 2, 3 hours, something like that. And direct calorimetry is not the best at doing short-term measurements, so it really doesn't do a very good job of that. Another source of error, so another con here, another con to direct calorimetry, especially when we're talking about exercise. So here there's a aerobic step, so it's not going to produce a lot of friction. But if this was an exercise bike or a treadmill, the moving parts of those exercise equipment, those pieces of exercise equipment, are going to produce heat from friction. And so that friction energy that's turned into heat is going to be measured the same as the energy that's coming off your body as heat. And so it's going to be difficult to see which is which. Is it the bike producing the heat, or is it the body producing heat? So it's going to cause a lot of error to the measurement. Another big con here is when people get hot, when they're exercising, they're going to sweat. And when we sweat, we're releasing liquid onto our skin. That liquid is going to evaporate, and it's going to dissipate heat away. And it's going to do so without actually raising the temperature of the room all that much. So sweat's going to add some error to this measurement because it's going to use evaporation instead of radiant heat in order to get heat off of your body. So in all intents and purposes, direct calorimetry is just not practical, and it's not accurate enough for exercise metabolism to be measured this way. So what do? So we do something called indirect calorimetry. So with indirect calorimetry, what you have is a person wearing this sort of headgear here. We have this mask attached to the front of their face, and with this you can have them exercise, you can have them resting, you can have them doing whatever you want to do. And so this mask, what it's doing is it's collecting all the air coming out of the face of the individual, so out of the mouth or out of the nose or both. And so with that, you can analyze the total volume of air coming out. You can analyze the amount of oxygen being used by the person, which is something called the VO2 that we've already talked about a little bit. So VO2 means how much oxygen was consumed. And we can also measure how much CO2 is produced. All right, so with aerobic metabolism, you're going to have CO2 being produced. Also with lactate, you're going to have lactic acid buildup, you're going to have some CO2 produced. If you're measuring CO2 production, that's something called VCO2. So VO2 was oxygen consumed, VCO2 is CO2 produced. If you want to learn a little bit more about how to perform an indirect calorimetry test, so looking at VO2 maxes or VO2 at a steady state exercise or at rest or whatever, you can scan this QR code or go to this link here and it'll show you a video on how to do a VO2 measurement. The pros of indirect calorimetry here are that it is highly accurate over a short period of time, unlike with the direct calorimetry that you needed several hours to maybe a day or two. Here we can get a fairly decent measurement in 15 seconds to a minute and get an idea of someone's oxygen consumption. The cons to indirect calorimetry, the first one's kind of like one of the cons of direct calorimetry. There's a lot of equipment. It's still very expensive. It's not as expensive as direct calorimetry, but you're still looking at probably somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 depending on the unit that you're using. So the metabolic cart that you're using, which is the name of this machine. So it is quite pricey. There's a lot of equipment. There's a lot of setup. There's a lot of things you need to put on the person that can be a little uncomfortable. So there's a lot to it. It doesn't measure anaerobic energy either. So that's another downfall. I already talked about this briefly in part 1 of this section, but VO2max is the best indicator of aerobic performance in athletics that are very aerobic based sports, so running, cycling, swimming, those sorts of things. But it's a little bit of an incomplete measurement. It doesn't tell you the full picture of that person's athletic ability. So again, it doesn't tell you about their anaerobic performance, it doesn't tell you about their exercise economy, and importantly, it doesn't tell you about some of these other things that are also important for an athlete's success in an endurance sport. So again, they need to have a high VO2 max, but they also need to have a high lactic threshold and the high exercise economy that I already mentioned. And if you're doing aerobic sports, you want a lot of type 1 muscle fibers. All right, so the type that are very fatigue resistant, that can contract repetitively for a long period of time. Let's come back just for a moment to this lactic threshold idea. So if we look at this graph here, we have work rate, so aerobic work rate on the x-axis, we have VO2, so oxygen consumption, on the y-axis, and we have two people who are pretty similar, but the purple line, this individual has a 17% greater VO2 max than the green line. However, if we look at the lactic thresholds, this purple individual hits their lactic threshold at 50% of their VO2 max, where the green person hits their lactic threshold at 65% of their VO2 max. Which, if you look at this, that means the person represented by the green line is actually able to work at a higher work rate, approximately 8% higher work rate, while staying under or at their lactic threshold compared to the purple individual here. So what that means is they can work at a higher work rate without feeling fatigued, without feeling muscle burning, without any of the signs that come from having large amounts of lactic acid production. So this individual, represented by the green here, although they have a lower VO2 max, they're probably going to outperform this purple individual in a long endurance type exercise bout, because the vast majority of that exercise bout is going to happen at or below lactic threshold. Because as soon as you go above lactic threshold, the time you can stay at that and maintain that exercise intensity is very limited. You can only do that for a short period of time before the muscle burning and fatigue catches up to you and you cannot continue it. So the lactic threshold is as important, if not more important, in some cases as the VO2 max of the individual for predicting their ability to do endurance-based sports. Let's switch now and talk about the units that are often used when measuring VO2 max of an individual. So we have two primary units that people use. We have absolute units and relative units. Absolute units are liters of oxygen consumed per minute of activity, where relative units are milliliters of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body mass. So you divide their body mass into the equation per minute of the activity. All right, so the difference between absolute and relative is we're making the relative units relative to the person's body mass. And that's really important because if you were to look at two different individuals and you wanted to compare them and see what their aerobic capacity were, the bigger individual is almost always going to have a greater absolute VO2 max than the smaller person. However, it's not about the total amount of oxygen they can consume. That's not what's important. What's important is how much oxygen per unit of their body they consumed. All right, so that's the relative units here. So a bigger person, again, is always going to have a higher absolute VO2 max. But when you make it relative to their body mass, it's impossible to say just based on their size who's going to have the higher VO2 max. In this unit here, the relative unit is the one that's more predictive of athletic performance. To give you a few numbers here, an untrained man is typically going to have a relative VO2 max somewhere between 44 and 50 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute, where an untrained woman is going to be somewhere between 38 and 42. So typically a little bit lower. A trained individual, either male or female, is going to have much greater VO2 max levels than an untrained individual. All right, so the difference between men and women here, there's a few different reasons for this. The primary reason, though, is women just have more body fat to them. And so when you're dividing their absolute VO2 by their body mass in kilograms in order to eventually get to this relative unit, you're going to be dividing it out by more tissue that's fat mass. Fat mass is fairly quiet with exercise. It doesn't use a lot of oxygen. It's not metabolically active the way lean tissue is. Per unit of muscle, men and women aren't going to be quite as different as what we see here, because this is not looking at unit of muscle, it's looking at total mass of the person, including their fat mass. Another term that needs to be brought up here is what's called a VO2 peak. So we've been saying VO2 max, but not every test where somebody's pushed all the way to their greatest ability at the moment is a true VO2 max. Sometimes that was a VO2 peak. All right, so every test has a VO2 peak, not every test has a VO2 max. All right, a VO2 peak is simply the highest value attained throughout the exercise bout, so during typically a graded or ramp exercise protocol. So this is an example of the type of protocol I'm talking about. Again, increasing aerobic work rates, increasing VO2s, and you see this nice linear response all the way until they get to around their VO2 max and it kind of levels out. So the VO2 peak, let's say this person was maybe sick this day, they had a cold or something, and they tried to do the test. They got to about here before they just couldn't do it anymore. They were too tired, too fatigued from the illness, and they had to stop. They weren't at their actual max. They could go all the way up to here, but they stopped here. So that was a VO2 peak, not a VO2 max test. All right, so again, every test has a VO2 peak. They have the highest level that they reach during that test, but not every test is a true VO2 max. And so we need to know if the test we did was a VO2 max or a VO2 peak, because we're oftentimes going to use these VO2 max tests in order to prescribe exercise intensities and things like that. And so we need to make sure it was an accurate test. All right, so depending on the source you look at, so different textbooks and articles are going to have different criterion and also different numbers of the criterion that need to be met in order to consider it a VO2 max. But here's a fairly common list of variables here, and even some of these variables, the thresholds are going to change depending on the textbook you look at. But anyway, so if the VO2 levels off despite an increase in work rate, that is one criterion. So you see here we have an increase in work rate. It has a linear response. The VO2 has a linear response all the way until you get to VO2 max, and you can see it kind of levels off here. It no longer increases linearly. So if the VO2 starts to level off, so there's less than 1.5 liters of oxygen per minute or less than 2.1 mLs per kg per minute increase after increasing the exercise intensity to another stage of exercise, so we're talking about a stage-based test here, that is a sign that they must have peaked themselves out and they have hit their true VO2 max. That's one criterion. Another criterion is having a post-exercise blood lactate level of greater than 8 millimoles per liter of blood. So remember, when you get to really intense levels of exercise, like at the top of this work rate here, you start to utilize a lot of anaerobic metabolism as well as aerobic metabolism. So if you're using a lot of anaerobic metabolism because the intensity is so high, that suggests that you're somewhere near your actual max. And so if you're producing enough lactic acid in order to get your blood lactate levels above 8, that's suggestive again that you hit your true max. Another one, the respiratory exchange ratio equal to or greater than 1.1. We haven't talked about this yet, but we will here in a moment. All it really is, though, is the amount of CO2 that you are producing divided by the amount of oxygen that you're consuming. All right, so if you get to a level equal to or greater than 1.1, meaning you're producing more CO2 than oxygen being used, that is also suggestive that you are hitting near your maximal abilities. Having a heart rate that reaches within 10 beats of your age predicted max heart rate. So you can do an age predicted max heart rate by just doing 220 minus your age. So if you're 20 years old, 220 minus 20 equals 200. Your maximal heart rate is probably somewhere around 200 beats per minute. Another heart rate based measurement here would be if the heart rate failed to increase with an increasing workload. So in other words, it plateaued, similar to what you're seeing here with VO2. So if we replace this VO2 with heart rate, it would have a similar response. It would have a nice linear response all the way up until you hit about your maximal ability, and then it would plateau off right before you had to stop. So if that happens with heart rate, that's another criterion. The last criterion here is an RP, so a ratings of perceived exertion, greater than 17 on the 6 to 20 scale or greater than 7 on the 0 to 10 scale. So this is how hard the person perceives the exercise about to be. So this is their own perception. This is a subjective measurement of exercise effort. So again, here we're going to say if you have at least 3 of these hit by the end of the exercise test, then it probably was a true maximal test. And then you can call this VO2 peak also their VO2 max. If you don't have at least 3 of these, then you can't call it a VO2 max. It was just a VO2 peak. And so you should wait a few days or something, a week or so, and then retest them to try to get their actual VO2 max. The exercise modality that we choose is going to have a major impact on the VO2 peak, so how high that VO2 is going to get. So typically you're going to see people, if they're trying to do a VO2 max test, they're going to be doing it on a treadmill, because treadmills are going to utilize the most muscle mass, at least of these common forms of exercise, ergometry. And so the more muscle mass you use, the more oxygen is being consumed, because the muscle is what's consuming the oxygen. So you're going to get the highest VO2 value possible. So again, most of the time you're going to see a treadmill used for VO2 max tests, with the exception of highly trained cyclists that are going to be just more adapted to using a cycle ergometer, so that's probably what they're going to use. But for a normal individual, the VO2 peak is going to be typically 5 to 11% higher in treadmill walking/running than what it would be doing leg ergometry, so exercise bikes. So leg ergometry is also going to be about 30% higher than doing arm ergometry, simply because the legs are bigger muscles than the arms. So the more muscle involved, the higher the VO2 peak is going to be. In an athletic population, it's really best to do a measured VO2 max, because measurements are always going to be better than estimates. Estimates are always going to have a lot more error to them. But there are downsides to doing actual measured VO2 max tests. So if you go back to the Indirect Calorimetry section of this talk, you can see all the mouthpieces and headgear and the sophisticated equipment required to do a VO2 max. There's a lot of skill and personnel knowledge also required to do that. And so VO2 max tests aren't done all that often. They're expensive when they're done, and they require highly trained personnel. So a much cheaper, easier test to do is going to be some sort of a VO2 max estimate test. And there are hundreds of these out there. There are so many of these. All right, so they're easier, they're cheaper, They're more commonly done. They can be done with submaximal protocols, so that can make it more safe for people who shouldn't be necessarily going all the way to their maximal ability. So think of frail old individuals, people with clinical diseases, people with recent injuries, whatever. All right, so VO2 max estimation can oftentimes be a nice substitute for the actual measurement. And in most fitness centers, this is what you're going to do. Also in most physical education classes, think of like the 1 mile run or the 1.5 mile run, the 12-minute run, the pacer test where you run back and forth, touching the lines in a basketball court, and the beeps get faster and you have to keep up the beeps. Those are all VO2 max estimation tests. All right, so those are done because they're easier, they're cheaper, and sometimes they're also safer. But as mentioned, if you can do an actual measurement and it's an athlete, you probably should do that. If it's not an athlete, if it's just somebody who's exercising for fitness or for fun or for health, a true measurement's not necessary. You should probably do an estimate-based test. So I mentioned a few minutes back the RER, or other names for this would be just R or RQ. The RER is the respiratory exchange ratio, and it is your VCO2, so how much CO2 you made, divided by the O2, which is how much oxygen you consumed. All right, so CO2 made divided by oxygen used. And so this is a really useful measurement to do, and it's oftentimes done when doing a true measured VO2 max. All right, so if we look here at the respiratory exchange ratio on the x-axis and relative energy contribution on the y-axis, and we can see carbohydrates go up as the RER goes up, and fat metabolism goes down as the RER goes up. All right, so in other words, the higher the exercise intensity, the more carbohydrates you're going to be burning aerobically, and the less fat you're going to be burning aerobically. Where if you go the other end of the spectrum, the lower the exercise intensity, all the way down to resting at energy expenditure levels. So right now I'm resting. I'm using mostly fat right now for my energy, and only a little bit of carbohydrate for my energy. All right, so this is an increasing RER. You could also view this as an increasing exercise intensity. All right, so how do we know how much carbohydrate or how much fat someone's using? So first off, I need to mention that we're ignoring protein here, because although our bodies can use protein for energy, our bodies choose not to, because generally speaking, if you're burning protein, you're burning up your actual muscle tissue or organ tissue or something like that. So you don't want to use protein for energy. We do use a small amount, especially for long endurance type sports, 2 to 10%, somewhere in that range. But it's such a small amount that generally speaking, it's negligible, and we don't really talk about much, which is why we're ignoring it here. But so how do we know how much fat or how much carbohydrate we are utilizing? So we know this essentially by chemistry. All right, so we're measuring the oxygen that's being used, we're measuring the CO2 that's being created, and we can look at the chemical formula of what's going on in order to figure out what the R or RER should be. All right, so this right here, this C16H32O2, this is palmitic acid. It's a very common fatty acid. In other words, it's fat. So it's a type of fat that's in our body that our body can use to make energy. It's a very common one. So what we have to do is we have to, you're going to use this up, and you have to combine it with oxygen, which is O2. And you're going to be producing CO2, which is carbon dioxide. You're going to be producing H2O, which is water. And with this, you're going to be making energy, ATP, so adenosine triphosphate. So what we have to do if we wanted to sit here and actually do the math and do the chemistry is we need to balance out the number of hydrogen on both sides of the equation and the number of the carbons on both sides of the equation. And we're going to be balancing that out by adding in the oxygen. All right, and then so let's just look at this palmitic acid here. So we have 32 hydrogens over here. So we need 32 hydrogens over here. So where the hydrogen is going to go on this side of the equation, it's going to be combined with the oxygen to make water. So each water molecule has 2 hydrogen. In order to make 32 total hydrogen, we need to then have 16 water molecules. So 16 times 2 equals 32. All right, so that means we need 16 H2O molecules, and we need to do the same thing with the carbon. All right, so we have 16 carbons over here, so we need 16 carbons over here. And so where the carbons are going to go is to create CO2, so that means we need 16 CO2 molecules because there's one carbon in each CO2. And so if we do the math here and we figure out how many oxygen molecules are necessary in order to make 16 CO2s and 16 H2Os with the 2 carbon that were in the original molecule, that the substrate, the palmitic acid, we come up with we need 23 O2 molecules because every O2 molecule is 2 oxygen. If this doesn't make sense to you, let's just simplify it here. We can, using chemistry and the math behind it, we can figure out that in order to break down this palmitic acid, we need to add 23 oxygen molecules, so O2, and it's going to produce 16 CO2s. And so if we throw that into the RER equation, or just R here, it's 16 divided by 23, that's 0.70. So when we're over here at 0.70, you're using very little carbohydrates and almost entirely fat. If we look down here at glucose, so C6H12O6 is glucose, we do the same thing. We add however many oxygen molecules in order to balance out the carbon and the hydrogen in this equation. We end up with 6 divided by 6, that equals 1. So when we get up to 1, that means we're producing almost entirely all of our aerobic energy through carbohydrates and almost no, if any, fat. So whenever your RER goes above 1.0, that means you're using entirely carbohydrates. So 100% of your metabolism is coming from carbohydrates. So you're producing a lot of it aerobically, but you're also producing a lot of it anaerobically. And so you start producing CO2. So if you're producing more CO2 than oxygen, that's what's going to drive this number above 1. Then that means you're buffering out a lot of lactic acid through the bicarbonate buffering system. That bicarbonate system, if you remember, the bicarbonate binds to the hydrogen, goes through the blood, gets back to the lungs, it splits off, and the CO2 comes off of it, and you breathe that off. And whenever you're breathing off a lot of CO2, more than what you're producing through the aerobic process, again, that's going to drive the RER above 1.0. So anytime you see an RER above 1.0, you're using all carbohydrates and you're producing a lot of lactic acid, and that's what's driving it above 1.0. So if you look back to the criterion for a VO2max test, one of the criterions was an RER of 1.1 or higher. So in other words, you're producing as much aerobic metabolism as you can. You're burning through your carbohydrates, and you're also starting to use a lot of anaerobic metabolism. You're past your lactic threshold in order to fulfill the energy requirements for that exercise bout. So that's why that is one of the criterion for a VO2max test. So let's talk about this a little bit more, this idea, this sort of crossover effect of carbohydrates and fats. So as we increase our exercise intensity towards 100% of your VO2 max, usually somewhere in this sort of 40% or so range, you're going to see the crossing where you're going to produce more of your energy through carbohydrate aerobic metabolism than through fat aerobic metabolism, just because fat is slower and takes longer to break down. So higher exercise intensities require faster energy liberation, so you're going to have to rely more on carbohydrates. All right, so at low exercise intensity, so below 30%, again, you're using mostly fats. Above 75% of VO2 max, you're using almost entirely carbohydrates. And again, there's a crossover that happens somewhere in between. It's going to vary a little bit person to person. Besides from a practical standpoint where we need to produce more energy more quickly and carbohydrates are faster, some of the things that are going to drive us to start using more carbohydrates is when you start to switch to faster types of muscle fibers. They're going to be better at doing carbohydrate metabolism than fat metabolism, so they're going to primarily use that. And also you're going to have increased levels of hormones, specifically the epinephrine and norepinephrine related from coming from the sympathetic nervous system, that are going to be promoting glycolysis and glycogen and glucose breakdown. So those are the things that are going to promote this transition from fats to carbs. It's a bit of an outdated topic now, but it is important for us to talk about it because you're going to see, especially if you go to some facilities that have older posters on the walls or older treadmills or bikes or whatever, you're going to see this idea of a fat burning zone. And occasionally you're going to see this on infomercials on TV and things like that too. So this is the idea, if somebody is exercising in order to lose weight, they're wanting to burn fat so they can look better, be healthier, whatever. All right, so if you burn more fat working at a lower intensity, or I should say if you burn a higher percentage of your energy coming from fat at a lower intensity, then should you work out at lower intensities in order to primarily burn fat? All right, so the issue with this is, first off, it doesn't matter where the energy is coming from during exercise. If you're burning energy, your body's eventually going to reshuffle energy around after you've stopped exercising. And so that energy is going to come from sources like fat eventually. So don't worry about where it's coming from. But let's still talk about this anyways. So at very, very low intensities, around, say, 20% of your VO2max, you're going to burn about 60% of your energy from fat. Okay, so that's what we're seeing here. 20% of your VO2max, 60% of that energy is going to be coming from fat. If we increase the exercise intensity just up to 50% of your VO2max, which is still not very intense, now you're going to be only burning around 40% of your calories from fat, and the rest, the blue here, is coming from carbohydrates primarily. So are you burning more fat at a higher intensity or a lower intensity? So if you're looking at the percentage of total calories coming from fat, then yes, you're going to be burning more percentage of your total. You're burning 60% from fat in the lower intensity and only 40% from fat in the higher intensity. However, if you're looking at total fat burnage, you're going to be burning more. So if you look at this dotted line here, the fat burning coming from this 50% of VO2max exercise intensity is actually higher than the exercise intensity that's only 20%, even though, again, the percentage of total is going to be greater on the 20% of your VO2max exercise intensity. All right, so what does this mean? This means, first off, you are burning more fat at the higher intensity load compared to the lower intensity exercise, regardless of the percent and the ratios and all those sorts of things. But as I already mentioned, it really doesn't matter where the energy is coming from. What matters is, if you're trying to lose weight, what matters is the fact that you're burning energy. All right, so this higher exercise intensity, if you do it for, let's say you're doing both of these for 20 or 30 minutes. This exercise intensity, say you're burning 100 calories. This one you're burning 200 calories. That's twice as much energy that's being burned. That means over time, if you do this, you're going to burn twice as much fat. So you're going to lose twice as much weight if you do this higher exercise intensity with the doubled calorie expenditure. So again, it doesn't matter where the calories are coming from during the exercise bout as far as weight loss. All it matters is that you're losing calories. So is the fat burning zone something you should think about? Absolutely not. It's completely bogus. It's a myth. It's something perpetuated by people trying to sell you equipment or supplements or really bad exercise programs or whatever. So the fat burning zone, as far as trying to lose weight, is not useful. Now, I will say there is one caveat here, is that the higher your exercise intensity, the more protein you're going to burn. So for people who are trying to minimize protein catabolism, so protein breakdown, it might be useful to exercise at a slightly lower intensity. So think of like a bodybuilder who's trying to lose fat while not losing protein, so their skeletal muscle. For them, for other reasons outside of this whole fat burning zone idea, it might make sense to work out at a slightly lower exercise intensity, but for a much, much longer period of time. And there's still some room for debate in that as well, though. I hinted at this a little bit earlier, but just to kind of put it in an organized package here for you, our bodies can use protein and break it down into amino acids and then use those amino acids in order to produce energy. Right? So we can break down the amino acids directly, or we can convert them into glucose through gluconeogenesis and then utilize that glucose. Right? So generally speaking, though, like I said, our bodies don't want to use protein as an energy source. In short duration exercise, only about 2% of your total energy production is going to be coming from protein breakdown. If you were to do much longer bouts of exercise, so think of like a long distance runner, when they're doing 10, 20 miles in a single session, so an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever, they are going to produce more of their energy through protein breakdown, up to 5 to 10%. We also talked about this briefly before, but just to hit on it, again, a little more organized fashion here. So what do we do with lactic acid? We can utilize it in the muscle where it's produced, and that's what most of it's gonna go. We're gonna just keep it in the muscle, and that muscle is gonna convert to pyruvic acid and then use it aerobically. But we can also do the lactate shuttle, which is when the lactic acid leaks out of the muscle fiber that created it, and maybe an adjacent muscle fiber that's not as active can actually take in the lactic acid and then convert to pyruvic acid and then use that aerobically, just like the original muscle cell could have. So this is called a lactic shuttle because it's going from one muscle cell to another muscle cell and then being utilized. Or if it gets into the bloodstream, it floats around the bloodstream, gets to the liver, and you see the lactic acid seeping out, gets to the liver, it gets turned into glucose through gluconeogenesis. And then it gets back to the muscle. It can be utilized as glucose now. This cycle of lactic acid, gluconeogenesis to turning it into glucose, and then back to the muscle, this is called the Cori cycle. All right, so I already mentioned that, but I just want to show it one more time in a little more detail. All right, this ends the exercise metabolism section. Part 1 was about what types of metabolism we were using for what types of exercise bouts and exercise intensities and things like that. Part 2 was a little bit of that, but much more about exercise metabolism measurements and things like VO2maxes and indirect calorimetry and that kind of stuff. So if you have any questions about any of this, you can feel free to put those in the comment section below and I'll try to get back to you. Otherwise, please come back and watch another video. Thanks.